I got a treat in the mail. This is a KnitCrate SockCrate. It includes 100 grams of extra nice sock yarn plus a lavender bath bomb. And here's what I'm doing with mine. In case you have the same thing and want to knit along, this video includes a pattern and a no-hole tip for where the heel joins the sock top. Let's get started. Here's the yarn from my February KnitCrate SockCrate round into a ball. And here it is being knitted. And it's pretty, but in my opinion, that's not the only good thing about it, not even the best thing about it. I'm going to let you watch me knit, and I think that'll make it obvious to you. I'm going slowly for two reasons, so you can see what I'm doing, and because I'm working from behind the camera. A sock yarn, in my opinion, needs to be springy. That allows it to retain a good fit, and durable, and pleasant to touch because it's in a very sensitive part of your body, actually. It's worn on a very sensitive part of your body. Your feet are quite picky. And this yarn has all of these things going. It's extremely pleasant to work with. And can you see that how springy it is as I stretch up and over, how that stitch pops back into shape? That is going to make an outstanding sock, besides making the knitting easy. I almost split a stitch there. I'm not perfect either. And I already know it's durable, and you might wonder how. The reason is because I first tried on a different loom. And I decided partway through I really did not like the results I was getting. It was my own fault, not the fault of the loom. I selected the wrong one. This is quite fine #1 yarn, also known as fingering or light fingering. And therefore I thought I wanted my very finest gauge loom. And I began working on the Cottage extra fine gauge loom, which it knitted just fine, but I was getting a fabric that was a little stiffer than I wanted. Now, I like my socks fabrics firm, but there's firm and there's stiff, and I was getting stiff even though I was getting the gauge that I had in mind, or close to it anyway. So I changed to this extra fine gauge loom. This one's a Kiss. They have the same name, but they're not constructed exactly the same. And therefore, this one gets a slightly looser gauge. Now, Cottage loom lovers, that's not a problem for you. If you own a fine gauge, I believe you're going to get an appropriate gauge and a nice fabric. I just don't own a fine gauge in that brand. So I switched to my Kiss, which I dearly love. And now things are going swimmingly. I am going to give you the pattern for the sock that I'm making, just in case you bought this packet too and you want to knit it. But I want to show you a few things first. You may say, what on earth is she thinking? That top rolls and it's not a very attractive cast on. That is because I decided to decide what to do about the top later. I have an idea that I'll show you in another video. So this is just E-wrapped and knitted on. And then I'm going to hang these E-wraps back on the loom and do something clever. At least that is the plan. Another thing I want you to see is the German short rows, or the method that I used instead of traditional wraps. And they do a very good job of preventing holes and making the heel strong. But even with German short rows, sometimes at the very top in there, you get a little hole. And you may see that I don't have one, not the whisper of one. I'm going to show you the technique for avoiding that next. And machine knitters, if you're knitting this sock, and this is for you too, this knits beautifully on the machine, you will use the same technique. The pegs that I lift off of correspond to your needles, and the needles that you will be lifting off of are those on the side of the bed that opposes the one you just knitted the heel on the left and right ends. I'm working on a sock, and I have finished my German short rows, so there should be no holes, but occasionally at the corners of the heel, this is my last heel stitch on one side, This is my last heel stitch on the other side. And I'm sure you've had it happen that in some yarns, little holes like to form where I'm pointing. I'm going to change pointers because I think this will be clearer. Right where the heel joins the foot. And here is a trick that will get rid of that problem if you're having it. This is the purl side of the stitch, the next stitch to the heel. Last heel stitch here. First stitch that wasn't involved in the heel. Lifting the loop, not the one that's on the peg presently. I'm trying to turn it so you can see better. But the one from the previous row. See that? Lift it and place it. If you try to do this early in making the heel, it's going to look as though it's too tight and it won't reach, but it loosens up by the time you get to the appropriate place. Let me fish this one out. Make sure I don't split the stitch. Make sure I don't get my yarn tail involved. Lift. And I want to point out this peg is not involved in the sock, nor is this one. I have adjusted this loom to not include those in the sock, so that's why we didn't hang it on them. It may not be obvious in the picture. This is the first peg that's involved in the sock. And now it has 2 loops on it. I'm ready to resume knitting clockwise, which is the way I use this loom the most, and knitting on around, secure in the knowledge that I should have no holes in my heel. And of course, this first stitch will be difficult because it's got 2 loops and one of them is stretched from having originally been elsewhere. But if you're careful, it goes just fine, and on we go. With sock knitting, gauge is everything. The difference in half a stitch per inch could make the difference between my socks and my husband's socks. No kidding. So you must not cheat. You must swatch. And here is a swatch that I made on the knitting machine. I had already swatched and achieved on this loom 8 stitches and 10 rows per inch, which is a nice dense fabric that will be comfortable on the foot without being stiff. So I wanted to match that on the knitting machine and see how it would knit. And it knits beautifully, by the way, no problems at all. And here's how you mark a gauge swatch if you're going to knit several stitch sizes. See those holes? There are 7 there. I used stitch size 7. Here there are 6. These are just transfer lace holes at the top of the section that I knitted at stitch size 6. And up here there are 5. Turns out this one was too tight, this one was too loose, and this one, stitch size 6, is just right. I did get 8 stitches and 10 rows per inch. Therefore, we can use the same pattern for both loom knitting and machine knitting. If you use centimeters customarily, you'll use 10 centimeters as your gauge swatch, and this gauge is the same as 32 stitches in 10, 40 rows in 10. To reiterate, this one is made on the Kiss loom, the extra fine gauge, and on the Brother knitting machine at stitch size 6. Now, machine knitters, you know perfectly well, I could have 2 Brother knitting machines from the same year and use the same yarn, and they take slightly different stitch sizes, so you must swatch. You don't just take my word for it. See what works for you, but it'll be close to that. This is the kind of pattern I make for myself. I've got all my gauge information, then I draw out a sock, and I make notes all around it about how many stitches and rows and short rowing details, and we'll go over it together. If you are a new sock knitter, you may need a little bit more help than this kind of pattern, and you will find it on my website, which is there. Look for socks of all sorts. There's a loom knitting version, and there are 2 volumes for machine knitters. If you're a new sock knitter, it's volume 1 that you want, that goes into the anatomy of a sock and how to figure all this with great care, even if you can't match the gauge perfectly. But I'm assuming for the sake of this pattern that you have matched my gauge perfectly. You're going to begin on waste yarn or an E-wrap. Waste yarn is for machine knitters. E-wrapping is going to be easier for loom knitters. And this is how many stitches to cast on. For sizes 5 to 7.5, ladies shoe size, 64. For sizes 8 to 10, 68. And of course you set up to knit in the round, as you see me doing on this loom. All those stitches are knitting, all those pegs are working. The top is very simple. After the cast on, knit 40 plain rows. You could use this pattern if you wanted a traditional ribbed top up here. Just cast on with that, knit however many rows of ribbing you want, and then proceed to follow the rest of the pattern. For this purpose, I'm having us knit 40 plain rows, which is going to be 4 straight inches above this point, the start of the heel, which is at the top of your physical heel, not the bottom. This is the floor. This is the top of your heel. So we'll have 4 inches of plain knitting plus the treatment that I plan to put at the top. These are summer socks, so I'm not making them very long. At this point, we begin short rowing on half of the pegs. You probably know that the rule of thumb is that you short row down to 1/3 of the number of working pegs. In fact, there are not even thirds in either of these numbers. You will be working on either 32 or 34 pegs, depending which size range you're making. So for the smaller sizes, short row down till the shortest row is 10 rows. For larger sizes, till it is 12 rows. I do recommend the German short rowing technique, and I have a detailed video on that, so we're not going to cover it here. Foot rounds. After the heel is completed, which is here, at this dotted line, and before we begin the toe, this runs down the length of your foot. It is knitted just as these rounds were knitted. And here are the numbers that you need for size 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10, 37, 40, 42, 45, 47, 52 foot rounds. If you do not perfectly match the row gauge, this is where you must adjust in order to make sure that your total length is what it should be. And you can measure your own foot to decide that. Oh, one more note. Machine knitters times 2. Why is that? Because when we are knitting on the loom, we're doing the counting. So we go round and round and round. 1, 2, 3. And we might make a mark on a paper or a counter or just count up afterwards by going like this and keep track. On the knitting machine, every time the row counter clicks, only half a round has been knitted. If we're starting at the right, we knit to the left, it clicks, but the round isn't finished until we knit back to the right. Thus, all of these numbers will be double. Let me see if I can do it in my head. I'd say 74, 80, 84, 90, 94, and 104. So for machine knitters, this column will produce socks exactly the same length as this column will for loom knitters, because we're counting 2 clicks on the counter every time we knit a round. Let's knit just a little bit more while I wrap up. I don't think I finished explaining that when I had to frog my sock, which is what we call it when we rip out the work that we have done, I rewound it. And I have knitted it into this sock, and there's just not the slightest sign of wear and tear from having misbehaved, basically. Therefore, I have very high hopes that this yarn is going to perform nicely and wear for years. And good sock yarns tend to. People sometimes say, well, is it really worth it? Because, Walmart has socks. Well, Walmart doesn't have socks like this. First of all, my feet are on the short side. And even with Lycra, sometimes they tend to bunch up on me in my shoes. The ones I make are exactly the right length, so of course they don't. Plus, they just feel and look so good. Yeah, I think they're worth the effort. So if you make a pair of these socks using this pattern, I would love to see them. You'll need to go to my website and find contact information. It's not possible for me to keep up with comments on YouTube or receive pictures that way. But I hope you enjoy your yarn as much as I'm enjoying mine.